Welcome to Module 2 in 289M. I'm your instructor, Robert McMillen, and we are going to be discussing managing organizational units and Active Directory accounts. So objectives, we're going to work with OUs, manage some user accounts, group accounts, and work with computer accounts. And we're also going to automate account management. So what's the benefits of using OUs? Well, you can create a very familiar hierarchical structure based on the organizational chart. And so let's say you have an organizational chart in your company, and you would like that to be mirrored in Active Directory. Well, you can do that. Delegation of administrative authority, so you can decide who's going to be in charge. Able to change the OU structure easily. You can move people and objects in and out of OUs. You can group users and computers for the purpose of assigning administrative and security policies. So we talked a little bit about group policy in the last module, and you can group people in that way, so group policy affects them the way you want. You can also hide AD objects as well. 3 different types of security principles can be assigned permission to an object. You can assign a user, you can assign a group, or you can assign computers. All to a particular object to give it permission. Let's just say you wanted to create a group. You can put users in it, and you can take that group and you can give access to a file share. That would be one example right there. Active Directory's object security settings are composed of 3 components. You have the discretionary access control list, the object owner, and the system access control list. So one is at the discretion of the administrator, then you've got the object owner itself, and then you've got the system that needs to have access in order to run programs properly. So default settings in AD users and computers hide some system folders. So we're going to be turning on the advanced features in Active Directory users and computers. Then after you turn those on, you see 5 new folders: lost and found, program data, system, quotas, and trusted platform module devices. And if you have Exchange installed, you'll see even more things. Exchange is a Microsoft email server. Most people nowadays use Office 365 or Google Apps, but there was a time when even the smallest of companies would have an Exchange server. And I'll tell you, it was very expensive to run because it was very buggy. So it's nice that a lot of people are moving off to Office 365 and let them deal with it. So there's advanced feature options in Active Directory users and computers as well. So you can click on Add and Remove for general user access to say the marketing folder in this case. But if you want to do special permissions, you can click on the Advanced button and you can see special permissions. User accounts have 2 main functions in Active Directory. So it provides authentication and it provides detailed information about the user. So when you log into a computer, you're being authenticated by the domain controller. When you access a shared folder, however, you're being authorized by the domain controller. 2 completely different things. Windows machines not part of a domain store, not part of a domain, store accounts in the security accounts management database on the local computer. So if you're not part of a domain, then it's going to keep all that information, the SAM database, on the local computer. User accounts created in AD, however, are referred to domain user accounts. They can log on to any computer in the forest. So people think that, hey, this is my computer, I log into my computer. Well, that's not the case. You can go to any computer that's a member of the domain and log in as yourself. It'll work on any one of them. So here's what the properties look like of a domain user. And here's what the properties look like of a local user. So if you go to your local computer into the management section in Control Panel, Administrative Tools, Computer Management, then you can see what you see on the right-hand side. On the left-hand side, this is if you go to Active Directory Users and Computers, and then you double-click on a user there, right-click and go to Properties. You can see there's a lot more different options here to configure. So there's different guidelines when it comes to the built-in guest account. By default, it's disabled. I recommend you just leave it disabled, because when a hacker goes to send malware out or whatever, they're going to be looking for that guest account to be enabled. So you should probably just leave it disabled. Guest accounts can have a blank password. Should be renamed if it is going to be used to something else so it's not easily guessed. and then the guest account has limited access to the computer domain. So it doesn't have access to a lot of things, but if you assign the everyone group to an object, such as a folder share, then it will have permissions there. And again, this is what hackers are looking for, so I don't recommend you do it. When creating a user account in the AD domain, keep a lot of different things in mind. User accounts must be unique. Account names are not case sensitive. Only the passwords are case sensitive. Develop a standard naming convention. Try not to name computers after people, because people come and go, right? So just name the user accounts after people. Complex passwords are required, and passwords, as I mentioned, are case sensitive. By default, only a logon name is required to create a user account. So we'll be creating accounts and editing accounts in this course. So this is what a new object looks like when you go through the wizard. And here's where you set the password. And typically you would say user must change password next logon if you want, and then give them a sort of a generic password. You could also say a user can't change password. And this is good for a resource account, because if you have an account that's not really being used by a real user, but maybe being used by an application, then you don't want that password to be changed. You could also say password never expires, which of course is never a good idea. However, I'm going to recommend you do that for your administrator account in Active Directory, because about 2/3 of the way through this course, your password for the administrator is going to expire, and it's going to creep up on you, and then you're going to have to remember a different password. So go into your administrator properties and check that box. And you can also disable the account as well. So you may want to disable an account for someone who has left the company, but their position's been terminated, whatever. So you can either use the PowerShell account, enable -AD account, and then you can do the -user and then the name, or you can just go and right-click on the account in Active Directory users and computers and just choose disable. There are templates for creating users, just like there's templates for a lot of different things in Active Directory, and a user account that's copied to create users with common attributes. So what I like to do is once, if I have somebody who's in a department and somebody new comes along and they need to have the same rights as somebody else, I'll just right-click on that person and choose copy. And it'll copy all the same attributes, put them all in the same groups as the user I'm copying. All I do is change the username and the password, and then that's good to go. Create one template account for each department or OU. Disable the template account to eliminate security risk. So if you do create a special template account, then what you want to do is you want to disable that in between using it and not using it. And that's because template accounts can be guessed. And if they have a lot of rights, then they can be used by a hacker. But if you just right-click on a user and choose copy and use that as a template, you don't have to worry about it. So you can select multiple users at once using the Control-click or Shift-click options. And you'll be doing this to enable all of your computer accounts and user accounts in Active Directory, because by default, when you use that csvde command to import them all, you import them all as disabled. So in order to enable them, you need to go and use Shift-click, for instance, to select them all and enable them. Make sure you don't select the groups, because you cannot enable or disable a group. It's either there or it's not. You can only enable or disable users and computers. Common actions that might be necessary: reset a password, easy enough. Right-click, choose, go to Active Directory using computers. Right-click on the user, choose reset password. Rename account, also easy. Right-click on a user, choose rename. You can also use PowerShell commands to do the same thing. And in every one of our labs, in 240M, 288M, and 289M, we will be including some aspect of PowerShell. And that's because your employers are going to expect you to know PowerShell. And also, when you go to take a Microsoft test, there's also PowerShell questions in there. So we want to make sure that you are prepared. You can go in and change a user logon name and also the logon hours, logon to. You can choose more than one domain if you have it. Unlock account and account options. All these things happen just by going into the properties of the name, by double-clicking or right-clicking, go to properties. You've got an account tab. Here's where you can change the person's logon name. And on the upper right section here, you can change the domain that they log on to if you have more than one. And of course, there's the login hours I told you about. And you can also make changes to the account options on how often they need to change their password or whatever it is. Profile tab, used to specify location of files that make up a user's profile. So when you log into a computer, say onto a domain, then you are going to automatically create a profile on that local computer. Instead of having it on the local computer, if you wanted to, you could have it on a server. And the good thing about that is no matter where you go, no matter what computer you log on to, that profile will download. So you'll have the same look and feel on every single computer you log on to. The only downside is if you save a whole lot of documents into that profile, then it may take a long time to download every time you change computers. The Member tab lists groups that users belong to, can be used to change group memberships, and it sets the primary group button when needed. So you can go ahead and change by adding the members if you want, but by default, domain users should be the default name, default group that you have. So the primary group, I should say. So you can add a whole bunch of other groups, but I would leave the domain users as your default one. Active Directory group accounts are the main security principal administrators to grant rights and permissions to users. So you don't usually assign users to gain access to a folder share. You normally assign a group because, as I mentioned earlier, you can have a group users come and go, and you just have to add them or delete them from the group rather than going into 100 different shares to make those changes. Two types of groups, security and distribution. The only one you really need to focus on is the security group. That's the one that gives you rights to access to print, access to folder shares, and things like that. But the distribution is really used if you have an email exchange server in your organization. If you have one of those, great. Then you can create distribution groups from there to send emails to massive amounts of people. But if you don't, completely ignore that altogether. So as I mentioned earlier, security groups, the main AD object administrators used to manage network resource. So this is where we go in and we add people to be able to access folders and printers, etc. So there's different types of group scopes, however. So I told you there's the security and the distribution. However, there's also a group scope option. You've got domain local, you've got global and universal. So domain local is the domain that you're on. Now we only have one domain, so that's easy. Global is if you have multiple domains. So you can create a global group to have access to, say, folder shares on more than one domain. Universal is if you not only have multiple domains, but you also have multiple forests. So you can create a single group that gives users and groups access to multiple forests and domains all at once. So one of these acronyms that you can come up with here is the AGDLP. Accounts are made members of global groups, which are made members of domain local groups, which are assigned permissions to local resources. So if you remember that AGDLP, then you'll kind of know, where groups and users fit into. Global group is mainly used to group users from the same domain with similar access or rights requirements. So you can typically name these after departments, locations, things like that. In multi-domain environments, so many domains under a forest, where departments are represented in more than one domain, then you want to have a global group. Computer accounts. Create an Active Directory when a client becomes a member of a domain. As I mentioned earlier, when you join your Windows 10 client to the domain, it creates a Windows 10 account. A Windows domain account for it. So, advantages of having users log on to computers that are domain members. Well, you have a single sign-on. If you log on to a non-domain joined computer, then every time you access a resource on the domain, it's going to prompt you for a username and password. You can do Active Directory searches for objects, group policies get applied to you, and also remote management by the administrator. So it's much better to have a user log into a domain joined computer than a non-domain joined. So you can create these accounts in two ways. You can either join the computer to the domain, and which we'll be doing in the lab, or you can just pre-join it to Active Directory. You can create it there, and it'll already be created when you go to join the computer to the domain. So it makes the joining of the domain happen a little faster. But other than that, there's no real advantage to doing it on in Active Directory users and computers first. So here's the computer name, and if you wanted to create it ahead of time, you've got the computer name, the pre to Windows 2000 name, which it's still in there. Someday they'll drop that off, and the default domain admins, user or group. So this is how you would create an account if you wanted to do it ahead of time. But if you're doing it from the computer, you go to the computer name and the system properties dialog. We used to go to Control Panel, System. Now we can just go right to the Start button and click on System. And then you can go in and change the domain from the local workstation to the domain, be prompted for the credentials, and you'll restart. So if the computer account doesn't already exist, then it gets created at that point. In the background, you don't even see it. Disabling computer accounts, just as easy as disabling a user. Go to Active Directory Users and Computers, right-click on the name, and choose Disable. Nothing to it. Command line tools for managing Active Directory objects. These may show up on a quiz or two. They certainly show up on Microsoft certification tests as well. So you can choose the ds-add to add users or computers, ds-get, modify, move, query, so all these different ones. You won't be using all of these, but ds-add is definitely one you'll want to memorize. Bulk import and export with csvde. Well, we did the csvde in Lab 1, so you know exactly what that is. Now the ldifde is a similar type of thing. It's not as common, but it also can allow you to create a lot of different accounts all at once. But csvde is just more efficient, so that's why we use that one instead. So we learned a lot about different types of organizational units, folders, templates, things like that. Groups we talked about. When you create a group, how do you do it? And there's different group scopes, local, global, and universal. So that does it for Module 2. And you can go ahead and get started in your labs, take your quizzes, and don't forget to come back to your slideshow and your book for the quizzes. Those are open book, and we'll see you in Module 3.